Again, the reason I've covered or introduced you very briefly to image contrast is so that you can very well distinguish between the contrast of an image, the black, the white, the gray scales, and what we're about to talk about, which is injection contrast. Two different things, completely different from each other. So what can you as a technologist in the state of Texas administer? You can administer contrast and or diagnostic levels of radiopharmaceuticals if you were a nuclear medicine tech, but we're talking about MRI. So who can administer contrast? A certified or licensed radiologic technologist. You can administer them under the direction of a radiologist or designated physician as long as they're immediately available. So when you're giving IV contrast, it's important to follow the package insert. Typically, the dosage will be either a single dose, 0.1 millimoles per whatever unit of weight the package describes, grams, kilograms, pounds, or 0.2 for a double dose. There are two methods of describing the concentration, and that is going to be either the weight or the molecular count. Weights are in grams, molecular counts are in moles. So what I showed you next is just a couple of examples. If your patient came in and he was 147 pounds, and your package says to give a single dose for MRI of the head, that you're going to multiply 147 times 0.1. That would give you a single dose of contrast. So in this case, the patient would receive 14.7 mLs of contrast. If the patient weighed 325 pounds, and again you're giving a single dose, 0.1 mmOLs, then you multiply 325 times 0.1 and you'll know to calculate out 32.5. Those are for single doses. Same thing applies if you're going to give a double dose of contrast for like an angiographic study. If the patient weighs 224 pounds and you multiply their weight in pounds by 0.2, you come up with 44.8. And that's how much contrast you would give the patient for that procedure. And then finally, if you were doing a double dose of contrast for a patient who weighs 112 pounds, you would multiply 112 by 0.2 and get 22.4 milliliters of contrast to give the patient. The storage of the contrast is very important as well and shouldn't be underestimated. It needs to be kept at the right humidity, the temperature, and then kept out of direct light. For power injectors, what I mean by never use a metal needle is do not use a butterfly that has a metal needle, tape it down to the arm, and inject. If you're going to be using a power injector, start an inner cath. Speaking of inner caths, typically a 20 gauge is more than sufficient for the rates of injection you'll be doing. You can usually get a 22 and do just as well. If you're going to inject into the hand, be careful of your flow rates. It can be very painful for the patient if you inject higher than 1.5 milliliters per second. Okay, so regarding IV sites other than the IV catheters you start, if a patient comes down with a central line, if you look at the tips of the catheter ends, it'll tell you what gauge that catheter is. For the most part, each department will make their own policies, but a radiologist will allow you to use them for the injection rates that we typically use in MR, which 2, 3, sometimes 4. When caring for an existing IV, it's very important to follow aseptic techniques. Make sure you wash your hands before handling any IV. Put on gloves. Wipe the hub of the IV with alcohol. Give it time to dry to kill the germs. Before injecting any type of contrast, you should flush the line with normal saline. Then you can inject your contrast. Then be sure to flush the line again to get the contrast out of the line. Lock the hub down and make sure that there's no dangling ends that can get caught.